This is Miss Britt, and welcome to Story Time. Today we are reading the story called The House That George Built, and it's about George Washington. And what house do you think that he built? That's right, the White House. Okay, so we're going to read this story, okay? All right, so it's written by Suzanne Slade and it's illustrated by Rebecca Bond. And again, here is the cover, even though it looks backwards, but okay. All right, here we go. Ooh, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, forward. A very short story before a real story. That's the definition of a forward. It all began when the American colonists became fed up with their English king. They were sick and tired of his outrageous taxes, unfair rules, and occasional temper tantrums. So the 13 colonies fought England for their freedom, and on July 4th, 1776, they formed their own country, the United States of America, which is where we live. Now, as you might imagine, this new nation didn't want another bossy, bejeweled king. Instead, the people decided to elect a president. They looked high and low for someone honest and fair. They searched far and wide for someone trustworthy and brave. That someone was George Washington. Look at that. George had many responsibilities as the first president. There were laws to pass, important people to meet, and an entire country to run. Although George was the busiest guy in the land, he wanted to create a home where future presidents would live. So, George set out to build a special house that would be a symbol of this great new nation. This is the story of President's House that George built. There. First, George looked for the perfect place to put his fine house. He searched the land and discovered a beautiful wooded hill in Maryland. On that hill, George found a lovely spot overlooking the sparkling Potomac River. This is the lot, that grand, scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Next, George needed a plan for the president's house. He held a contest and offered $500 or a gold medal to the person with the best design. When the countries Just kidding. When the entries started arriving, George got worried. Some drawings were too small and simple for this strong, growing nation. Others were too fussy and frilly for this hardworking new nation. Then George spied a magnificent drawing with the majestic columns, grand staircases, and a stately oval room. James Hoban's design was just right, and he won the contest. This is the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Even though George held the most important job in America, he didn't think he was too important to lend a hand to the building project. George strapped on his boots and helped survey and measure the construction site. He pounded in wood stakes to mark the exact location where the president's house would be built. George Washington was not a lazy guy. Not one bit. A large hole was dug between the stakes and filled with stone, wood, and sand, creating a firm foundation for the president's house. This is the foundation that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. that construction going on. Now, George needed bricks, lots of them. But how could he get thousands of heavy bricks up the steep hill? Fortunately, the mud beneath George's feet contained clay and sand, the perfect ingredients for making bricks. Soon, 2 kilns were baking up red-hot bricks around the clock. Bricklayers used the fresh bricks to lay straight, sturdy walls. This is the brick that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Ooh, it's coming together. It's coming together. Yeah. Then George faced another problem. The nearby quarries didn't have enough stone to cover the outside of the president's house. He knew there was plenty of beautiful, smooth stone in England, but he could never crawl back to the king. No way. So George changed the house plan from 3 stories to 2, so it would need less stone. Interesting. That's why it's only 2 stories tall. Stone workers carved flowers, leaves, and ribbons in the soft sandstone. Then the stone was painted with a thick sealer made of water, lime, salt, glue, ground up rice, which turned the house white. So it turned white because of ground up rice. That's crazy. This is the stone that was chiseled and honed, that went over the brick, that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Construction. Yeah, okay. Progress on the president's house was slow, but George wasn't discouraged. Carpenters built a wooden frame for the roof. They hammered sturdy timbers to support the inside walls. By now, over 100 workers, free men and slaves, lived on the construction site in small temporary huts. They labored from the sunrise until sunset, 6 long days a week. Busy with presidential duties and the house, George worked 7. This is the wood that was sturdy and good, that was nailed near the stone, that was chiseled and honed, that went over the brick, that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Before George knew it, 8 years had gone by. The president's house was nearly finished, and so was his time in office. During George's last year as president, building officials asked him to change the plans because the house was getting too expensive. George approved their request to use slate instead of lead for the roof. So the president's house was topped with slate rock. Unfortunately, this heavy roof leaked when it rained. This is the roof that was almost waterproof, that went over the wood, that was sturdy and good, that was nailed near the stone, that was chiseled and honed, that went over the brick, that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, that was dug for our nation, that held the design that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. George's term as president ended in 1797. He moved back home to Virginia where he spent time with his family until his death in 1799. Sadly, George didn't want to live to see the second president. He didn't live. He wanted to live, but he didn't live long enough to see the second president, John Adams, move into the president's house on November 1st, 1800. Although the house wasn't completely finished, the plaster walls were still wet and the winding staircase had only a few steps. John and his wife Abigail made it their home. This is the day that John came to stay under the roof that was almost waterproof, that went over the wood that was sturdy and good, that was nailed near the stone, that was chiseled and honed, that went over the brick that was baked strong and thick, that was laid on the foundation, that was dug for our nation, that held the design, that would stand for all time, that was drawn for the lot, that grand scenic spot for the president's house that George built. Here's Abigail and John Adams. Many neighbors stopped by to welcome John and Abigail, but most really came to sneak a peek at their incredible home. It is beautiful. This is the house that George built. That's the White House. The end. And just so you know, you can actually go to Washington, D.C. and you can visit the White House and you can tour it. So make sure one day you go and you check this awesome place out. Okay? Yay! Okay, happy story time. Bye!